We're back in the public interest with Karthick Ramakrishnan, who is the founder of AAPI Data. Karthick is someone that I've been relying upon for many years for all of my data when it comes to polling. You've been following all of these elections very, very closely. You had kind of a shock poll earlier this year that we'll talk about in a moment, but you have some new information now as I think the definitive source of AAPI-related polling data. Just give me the latest on this Harris-Trump race and what you've discovered.
Thank you. We had done a survey in the spring that showed that Biden had lost a lot of support among Indian Americans and Asian Americans more generally, but particularly among Indian Americans, right? So you saw almost a 20-point drop for Biden between 2020 in our pre-election poll and then in 2024. We also saw relatively low, but still net favorable ratings for Biden and for Harris, but Harris wasn't doing much better than Biden. But we didn't see a lot of increase for Trump. So the way I interpret that is people are sitting on the sidelines. They're not really happy with the choices before them, not happy with Biden. When we released that data the following week or 2 weeks after that, Biden dropped out of the race and then Harris came in. And so we saw a lot of anecdotal evidence of enthusiasm and interest, all these massive Zoom calls, fundraising efforts, and the like. But we didn't know whether that translated to actual vote choice, vote intention. And so we released a survey just this week, literally 2 days ago, which showed a high level of voter enthusiasm. It looks as high as it did in 2020, which was a record year for turnout for Indian Americans and for Asian Americans more generally. And Harris has restored that kind of, it almost looks like an Obama winning coalition among Asian Americans. So that's a pretty big jump. What's different is you see, so she's restored that. So you're seeing now a 69% level of support among Indian Americans for Harris. And it's even higher when you look among, and we can't do it for Indian Americans, but if you look at Asian American women, you're seeing a gender gap that is emerging now that we have not seen before for Asian Americans. And it doesn't seem as much related to Trump as it is related to Harris. So you're seeing a lot of Asian American women who are inspired by Harris and probably feeling a bit of, the glass ceiling that they experience in the workplace, but abortion's also playing a big role. Abortion policy remains, we have a particular way of asking the question. It's not about what issue matters to you in this election. Actually, I'm pretty skeptical that that's going to yield much in the way of information. People say the economy, and yet they say that they're going to vote for the Democrats, even if they think the Republican Party might be better on some issues. So partisanship drives a lot of vote choice. But we asked a question, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing here, but the way it's set up is, is there an issue that basically we're going to there's a list of issues. And for each issue, let us know if you could vote for a candidate that you disagree with on that issue, or is that issue so important to you that you could not bring yourself to vote for that candidate? So we had issues like Israel-Palestine, gun control, abortion, crime, a few issues like that. What we found was the number one issue. We found this in a survey we asked several months ago, and it still holds true. Racism and discrimination. That surprised me the first time I saw it. I'm looking at your reaction. I was like, I did not expect that. Because you think that's just kind of baked in. You know where the parties are. You know where the candidates are. There's almost nothing new that you gain. But what that tells me is that even if Asian Americans, even if Indian Americans are dissatisfied with the incumbent party based on their economic performance, like all the racial rhetoric, the racial divisiveness, they can't bring themselves to get over that hump, right? And so that's going to be a problem for not just Trump and Vance, but for the Republican Party, and not only in the short term, but potentially longer than that. But they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot, not being able to make as many inroads as they might. So that's one of several findings that we had. Abortion policy is the number two, so you have and especially true for Asian American women, but even Asian American men. good chunk of them say that is a no-go issue for them, in which, they can't get over that hump. Know that for Asian Americans, and especially for Indian Americans, if you talk about policies that are grounded in Christian conservatism, it doesn't really play that well in our communities, either because of religious diversity or just the fact that we don't have a very high proportion of self-identified Christians, right? And so all of those dynamics are at play. But I would say the bottom line is you are seeing an energized base. They're fired up. And the kind of coalition that Harris is building is starting to look more like Obama, but probably Obama 2008. 2012, Obama had further consolidated his hold in different Asian communities, but it looks like Obama 2008. It doesn't look like Clinton 2016, which is interesting.
Well, I think the racial discrimination point is a really interesting one, because I think that's always held the Republican Party back, just given there's been a history of bigotry going back centuries, and yet we still see that rhetoric today. Now, take me back to the original poll, which was kind of shocking, and frankly, you gave me great fodder for the RNC and the DNC, so thank you for that, because I basically asked, if you guys watch our programming, I asked that question of almost every political leader I ran into, that Indian Americans were in play, having 19% decide that they would go independent effectively, 17%.
Or at least they were reserving judgment, right? They were waiting and saying that they weren't just going to be a lock for the party.
Right. Yeah. I mean, only 2% went to Trump. So really it was like, it was a swing vote. But we go back to 2016, and Hillary Clinton ostensibly had 78% of the Indian American vote, and then going down to 46% for a second term for Biden. That was quite a shocking leap. So you're saying at this point, from 46%, it's gone up 23 points to 69%. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So it's that is a huge swing. You can think about it potentially. Kind of feels like a little bit like a rubber band effect, right? And so, but yes, most of it is, I think it's the people that were frustrated with Biden. And important to note, that first poll that we had done that had Biden at 46, that was before the disastrous debate performance that Biden had, right? At least the other polls that we see, the debate didn't change it that much in the general population. So I'm not sure how much, it could have been even lower, by the time Biden dropped out. We don't know, right? We don't have as many frequent surveys of Asian Americans as we do for the general population. So it is remarkable. And I'll say, it's someone who's spent a lot of time in California, like you. Harris was a big question mark, right? When she ran for Senate, she had locked in that nomination on the Democratic side by the time she announced it. Like, there was no serious and credible challenger in that race, right? And so
it's true of a lot of states, by the way, a lot of different races around the country where, you have an incumbent or you have a party that's strong and you steamroll right to the finish.
Yeah, that's right. And then Harris did not do very well when she ran for president, right? I mean, she dropped out early because between Biden and Bernie Sanders, it didn't look like she was going to win California. And so she was smart in dropping out. But she did decently well as a vice presidential pick. And I think she's grown a lot over the last few years. So, I think the people had a lot of low expectations because they'd only seen little bits of her being a vigorous campaigner. But once she got this opportunity, she really rose to the challenge. I mean, I did not know what to expect. And I think a lot of Asian Americans, just the American public in general, didn't know what to expect. And it was very well organized. But it's also the energy that she brought, right? And it's interesting. It's funny. You see a lot of this coverage about, it's about the vibe, and people are dismissing that. It's like, well, do you want low energy and having to drag yourself out of the house to go and volunteer for someone and ultimately encourage other people to vote? Or do you want to get fired up? And the energy gap, between the Republican and Democratic side was so huge when Biden was in the race, and now it seems like the scales are more even.
Break down the gender differences, if you would. I understand you don't have something granular between Asian Americans and, say, Indian Americans, but how pronounced is this difference? I mean, you would imagine the first Indian American female presidential candidate would certainly get, Indian Americans inspired. Certainly the black female audience, have actually dropped support for President Biden. So I'm sure a lot of that has been recouped or exceeded where Biden was. So break that down for me. And what about men as well?
Yeah. So when you look at Asian Americans, where we can see that, do that split by gender, it's about a 10-point gap, and it's a statistically significant gap. We have not seen that before. When people talk about a gender gap in voting, that's primarily been among white people, between white men and white women. That's where you've seen a gender gap traditionally. Among racial groups, there has been a gap, but it has not been big. I have not been tracking, at least from some of the polls that I've seen, you're seeing a meaningful gender gap among Latinos and black folks, because Trump has been attracting, especially younger black men, younger Latino men. We don't see much evidence of that in the Asian American side on younger Asian American men being pulled in that direction. But we had another question about Harris's identity. It was really fascinating. So we said, here are different aspects of Harris's identity, and which aspects of these identity are important to you. So we asked about her identity as an African American, her identity as an Asian Indian or South Asian, her identity as a woman, and her age. I would have thought that people would have said either her identity is an Indian or South Asian, it's an Asian American survey that we're doing, or maybe her identity is an African American, because these have been like big issues that have been debated about. Trump has made it an issue, just received a lot of airtime. Not much airtime on the fact that, that she potentially be our first female president. Her identity as a woman just is like, that's the strongest effect, right? Much stronger than her racial identity, either as an African American or as an Indian American. So I feel like what's interesting is that gender definitely matters in this election, but it's under the radar. She's not talking about it. The campaign's not talking about it. The Trump campaign is not making a big deal out of it. And that is really fascinating to see that here is something that's kind of hidden in plain sight. Yeah. Someone would be like, of course it makes sense. She's a female vice president running for the top job in the country. Of course, her identity as a woman would be history making, but she doesn't talk about herself as a history making candidate. She wants to just be seen as a competent candidate.
And maybe it's because we've seen this in 2016, right? Hillary Clinton, that campaign was largely about her female identity. That was very front and center, and maybe that took away some potential swing voters. I mean, who knows?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think there's definitely lessons learned from there, right? Where it's not something you want to lead with, especially if you're talking about the commander-in-chief. It's not really clear that would be a winning strategy. So I think there's definitely learning from that. But you also have had policy development since then, right? Especially on abortion. Kind of Roe v. Wade being struck down was theoretical back in 2016. It actually got struck down, right, in 2022. So that's a big deal now. So that's where I think you can have gender be a dynamic without making it an explicit part of political campaigns and discourse.
So,
one other thing I'll say, I've been thinking a lot about that Clinton 2016 and Harris comparison. So she's a woman of color, right, which is different than being a white woman. So that one of the things, since it's just a more general public affairs kind of show, it's like, I think we are at a point now where you cannot have a winning Democratic Party ticket without a person of color, either on the presidential slot or vice presidential slot. The math just won't work out. Democratic Party's too dependent on people of color to kind of, maybe not ignore that constituency, but at least having some part of that constituency feel like they don't have representation at the top of the ticket, right? So that's point number one. Point number two, and I don't think most people appreciate this. I did not appreciate this until recently, just thinking long and hard about it. Having someone who's the vice president for like a commander-in-chief job, it gives voters more assurance. I mean, yes, you can talk about the talk. She's supposed to be a border czar, and it, didn't deliver on what people might have expected of her. But she can talk about how she's gone to different countries and met with heads of state. She's talking about her meetings with Zelensky. Of course, Clinton, as Secretary of State, could also do that, but Vice president's like basically you're a president in waiting. So you have access to briefings that Secretary of State might not have, right? So it just brings, I think, a different kind of profile and potential assurance to voters who maybe not consciously, but maybe subconsciously wonder, about, especially thinking about America's like military strength and what that person brings to the table.
So was the methodology for this survey the same as what you used to discover that Biden had dropped 19 points earlier this year?
No, that's a good question. It's a different methodology. So that survey, was a combination of phone and online surveys, but it had a much larger sample size. And so we used a different survey vendor. This one, we went with Amplify AAPI, which is run by NORC, the University of Chicago. So even though I'm at Berkeley now, NORC is a solid, internationally recognized for decades, doing solid social science research. And the thing is, they have in-language polling capability for Asian Americans now, right? So it was a different methodology, but this is the same methodology that we use in our Associated Press NORC surveys. And we had asked about candidate favorability on Nikki Haley, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, back in November of 2023. And we see a massive jump in Harris favorability. Same method. So that gives me assurance that it's not just based on how we designed the survey that we're finding this difference. It feels like a real change. And that's also interesting, right? When you're a vice president, the president's favorability is going to weigh heavily, either in favor or against you. One thing that's fascinating, though, by the way, and we saw this in our survey, but I've seen it now in other surveys, including surveys of Latinos, as well as more general surveys. J.D. Vance is not helping Trump among voters of color. Either people don't know who he is, or they have a pretty strong net unfavorable. So Walz and Vance, among Asian American voters, among Indian American voters, Walz is doing much better than Vance is.
And for folks out there who see all this polling data, right, as soon as Vice President Harris got in the race and things shifted dramatically, that might be skeptical of all the general polls, right? I mean, every single one at this point seems to be really neck and neck, or it gives Vice President Harris a slight lead, within the margin of error. But still, I have noticed when I talk to people that they are skeptical about this information. Tell me about your perception of these national polls versus the poll that you conduct, and how do you kind of get a gauge of what is legit and what people should be paying attention to?
Yeah, one of the big questions when you have pollsters who are very sophisticated in their methodology in finding different results, one of the biggest differences comes in terms of how you weight the data. Do you weight the data based on party registration as it looks now? Do you weight it based on what turnout among party registrants look like in 2020 or 2022? So that's the difference. And what those represent are different guesses as to what it's going to be a turnout game. And so that's why you're seeing differences. So it's either all of it looks like it's going to be close, and it's going to come down to 5 to 7 states, right? And so that's where there could be some kind of game-changing event in October, an October surprise, maybe some foreign policy thing, who knows? That changes the dynamic. But that makes sense to me. The other part I would say is in our survey, what we see are some patterns that are fairly stable, right? In terms of party identification, changes, but not as dramatically as intention to vote and vote choice. That's changing much more dramatically. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Indian Americans, yes, they've been leaning Democratic for a while, but they're still persuadable, right? They're paying attention, and I think this, what you saw in terms of this volatility and support for Biden and Harris, is part of that. It's what a lot of the political donors were. A lot of them are getting concerned even before that debate performance by Biden, but certainly after that, they were starting to head for the exits, right? And that he was kind of done for, especially among the donor class. So, and I think it's interesting to think about Asian Americans and Indian Americans not only as quintessential swing and persuadable voters, but maybe saying a little bit of reality through less partisan lenses. Every one of us sees through some kind of partisan lens. It's just unavoidable at this point in terms of how strong party polarization is. But it seems like Asian Americans are less vulnerable to that.
And finally, if you have a conversation with either party at this point, you've got approximately a month to get their attention. I frankly have not seen significant outreaches from my own travels around this country, going to the conventions and the first Harris Trump debate. I have not seen serious outreach to Indian Americans and South Asians specifically. Just some causal things. What advice do you have for both parties if there's a whole bunch of people that are still in play, especially in these swing states?
Well, I am nonpartisan, so I don't go to political fundraisers, so I don't know what's going on there. I have gotten I'm on the list for Indian American Impact. I don't know how I got on the list, but it's been interesting to see, and I think I detect a fair amount of engagement from that group. Now, I don't know if the
WhatsApp group is very significant. I have not seen that same level from the Republican Party for sure, but I'm just trying to get a sense of your thoughts, because I went to the Prime Minister's visit at Long Island. We did a live broadcast, and a lot of those folks are the Modi-based people who've gone to multiple Modi events. But I have noticed a shift, at least since going back to 2015, 2016, of middle-aged Indian Americans, that many of the people were at this Long Island event who told me, hey, we were Democrats, and now we're going to vote for Trump. And I heard that repeatedly. So speak to that, because I do tap into these circles. Well, and I live in California, so I'm around a huge Democratic base, and that's why I don't want to overcorrect as well.
Yeah. I imagine that the majority of them, maybe a vast majority, are men. These folks that you're talking about.
Well, men and women. No, I actually...
If you had to guess about rough proportion, is it 50-50? I'm sure.
No, I'm sure there was majority men there. I'm sure there was.
Yeah. I mean, what we saw in between 2016 and 2020 is that Trump made inroads among middle-aged Indian American men. So what you're seeing on the ground, we saw that in our survey data, but we still saw that Biden won the majority of Indian American men in 2020. But in terms of erosion, that was definitely happening. We don't see further erosion. So my guess is that these folks probably had shifted a few years and have stayed there. But I don't see evidence of Trump making further inroads there. And I think what you're also seeing is this, a strong and solid, committed minority, but not a majority, right? And so we're talking about over 2 million Indian American voters, right? And so, yes, you're bound to see thousands and even hundreds of thousands of people that might have been Democratic before and that have shifted. So I think that's, at least what I would say, is that it's not just our surveys, but other surveys that all point in the same direction. So it gives me more confidence. We're still far away from a time where we have dozens of surveys on our community, and I hope we get there. I don't want to be the only one or one among 2 or 3 that are doing this. I think we all benefit from having more surveys in our community.
And I have to ask about this. SB 403, very controversial in California. Did that have any impact on some of this?
Was this the caste discrimination?
This was the caste discrimination bill. I mean, especially, a few months ago when Biden was still the candidate. Because, in my view, we obviously covered this thing very incessantly. I mean, that was brought up to me by anyone who was politically engaged, especially in California. And this had far-reaching implications nationally. People were worried that it was endorsed by the California Democratic Party, and people were blaming every Democrat, whether they're running for city council or running for a federal office. They were saying, the Democratic Party did this, and I'm not going to support it.
Yeah, I think it's still one of these early issues to track. And I think there's a way that an issue like caste discrimination, I think, can be handled if it's done from within the community as a set of critical conversations, honest conversations that we have, and then plays outside. Just from what I could observe, that legislation and that dynamic was political from the outset, right, in terms of what motivated people to even put it on the first place. Didn't seem like a lot of thoughtful preparation had gone into that. I think the fact that Newsom vetoed it, I think, sends a pretty strong signal to people that the Democratic Party is divided on this issue. And but I think it remains to be seen, right? I don't think Biden weighed in on that issue. Harris certainly hasn't. I think most smart politicians would not touch it.
I agree with you there, though we'll see if Vice President Harris wants to comment on it, but I'll certainly bring it to her attention when I get a chance in the near future. Karthik, really appreciate your time. As always, Karthick Ramakrishnan, founder of AAPI Data. Really appreciate it. Thanks very much.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks.